Hi, I'm Zahar. Welcome to my podcast, The Weekly Point with Z. Now, if you haven't been to this podcast before, this is episode 3, and it's also episode 2 out of 2 in a limited series on the inability of Middle Eastern countries, in particular Arab countries, in influencing global events. Now, to get started, I wanted to recap on the previous episode, provide a little bit of a summary for a few minutes just to provide context. But if you'd like to learn more on the topic, then please go and check it out. If not, then this would allow you to kind of pick up from where we left off and go through this episode independently. Now, before I provide that summary, I just wanted to correct some of the information that I shared in the previous episode, which I believe was missing some additional context or was not entirely accurate. I had a friend reach out to me who is much more knowledgeable on the politics in Syria, in particular, because he's a Syrian citizen as well. And he corrected some of the information I shared. And since I take great pride in trying to share as much as possible in as close to the truth as possible, because there's always different versions of the truth, I pride myself on sharing a point from the Middle East that is as close to reality and the truth as possible. So I just wanted to correct that information. He mentioned that I think President Kouatly was not from the Syrian military. He was the first president of Syria, and then there was different Syrian presidents up until Hafez al-Assad, who was a member of the military forces of Syria and who led a coup d'etat and toppled the regime in Syria. Now, I acknowledge that that was somewhat erroneous, and President Kouatly was the first president. He was a civilian president, and then there was obviously President Atassi, President Hafez, and so many different presidents. And just to provide context, that period of Syrian politics, of Syrian history, was marked by a lot of turmoil. So many governments were changed within the span of a few months, and there was a lot of instability in that period of time, which led to the eventful rise of the Ba'ath Party, and then the coup d'etat led by President Hafez al-Assad, and then that transfer of power to his son, Bashar al-Assad. Now, to recap on some of the points from the previous episode, we discussed some topics around how Arab countries, with the help of the West, propped up centralized regimes that are often suppressive, that are often very aggressive against any deviation from a central vision of what a normal citizen should look like or act like, and how the West kind of took advantage of that because it was a fail-safe system to kind of contain the region and ensure stability and avoid any repercussions that would eventually spill over to Europe, and how many Arab regimes were disconnected from their people because all they did is prioritize causes that are not necessarily aligned to the will of their people. They lacked credibility, and how the people's aspirations, values, objectives, and causes are not necessarily what's on Arab leaders' minds, and it's not necessarily what they promote abroad. And we also talked about this social contract whereby the government ensures some sort of stability in whatever shape or form that is, and with all of the good and bad that comes with, and how they ensured somewhat of a smooth transfer of power within the same regime or within the same apparatus of the state, and then things kind of got stable, and there was this status quo or some sort of peace in place that kind of ensured that everyone is sort of expecting what would come next. There's no turmoil, there's no instability per se, or at least that was the premise of what the central systems or central governments promised to provide. Now, We talked about this end of the equation. Now I just wanted to talk about the other end of the equation. And as I mentioned previously, you can't necessarily influence global events if you don't represent the will of your people and if you rely on the support of the West. So you can't influence decisions in the West, or at least with those who broker power in the West, if you're reliant on handouts and aid from the West. Now, this was one end of the equation. The other end of the equation is Arab leaders, because they prioritized prosperity and a certain status quo for so long, nearly 40 or 50 years, they kind of lost track and lost sense of how dynamic the world is. They tended to miss out on a lot of very important concepts that I believe dictate the fate of the region now and will probably dictate it for years to come, which ironically left them in a situation where they got the opposite of prosperity. There's so many issues brewing under the surface. There's so many concerns. There's so many grievances. There's so many issues that are bubbling and reaching to the surface, whether internally or externally. And I don't think Arab leaders, at least in the version that we have today, are capable of dealing with them. They're trying their best. There's obviously variant degrees of success between countries. But I don't think Arab countries and regimes are set up in a way to be able to cope with this kind of changes. Now, to elaborate a little bit further on what I mean is, in the mind of an Arab leader, or at least the way I understand it, the world is tribal. Alliances are here to stay. As long as I'm doing my end of the deal, the West or someone else or NATO or whatever other nation I'm aligned with is going to do its end of the deal. It's going to keep their end of the bargain. They're going to keep their end of the bargain. And the other thing is, they believed that whatever they provided was sufficient, which is not necessarily the case. So the world is very dynamic. It's not tribal. Alliances are non-traditional. It's not untraditional alliances are more prevalent than traditional ones. The world is driven by national interests. It's not about who I like or who do I align with or who do I enjoy visiting every now and then. And if you know anything, it's human nature. I love my neighbors, but we don't always agree on a lot of things, and so on and so forth. So the thing is, alliances shift and interests shift, and the world is in constant motion. And the friends of today are not necessarily the friends of tomorrow. And what I mean by that is, whatever I offer today does not guarantee me the same outcome as we progress along, because there are so many different factors outside of my region that impact the decisions of my allies or my partners. And to provide an example of that, and I think that's where it hit very close to home for many of the Arab leaders, it's the fateful decision by President Obama to shift focus from the Middle East to Asia, where China is a much bigger concern. And by doing so, he decided to kind of pull out of the region, diminish, well, I wouldn't say diminish, but at least minimize U.S. influence in the region and outsource the problems of the region for key regional players or major nations within the Middle East. And what that did is they kind of made the decision, President Obama kind of made the decision to divide the region among a group of players rather than one set of allies that are all aligned to the U.S. and functioning on the same page or within the boundaries or the confines or the framework of a certain direction. Now, what that meant is, and I recall reading this in one of the leaks somewhere, or one of the articles, that President Obama mentioned that the Arabs, or at least the Gulf Arabs, the Arabs of the Arabian Peninsula or the Gulf region of the Middle East, need to learn how to play with Iran and share the region, which was not something you would have imagined a few years ago, and which is something that came as a shock for many in the region, including Israel. Now, what he meant, I don't particularly think he only meant Iran. I think he meant Iran and Turkey, because Turkey, obviously, there was an enablement of the Muslim Brotherhood. And just as a side note, I don't think the Muslim Brotherhood that is in Turkey is the same as the Muslim Brotherhood that is in the Arab world. I know that a lot of people mix the two because it's mediatized as such, including in Turkey, but it's not necessarily the case. I think Turkey has an entirely different system whereby the murshid or the religious guide of the Muslim Brotherhood has no influence. I think Turkey is more of a state that functions as a normal state, which prioritizes national boundaries rather than religious affiliations. But again, it's not something that I want to explore for too long in this episode. It's something that I would probably talk about in future episodes. But anyway, I just wanted to make that note because it will become important at some point. And then there was as I mentioned, there was the enablement of the Muslim Brotherhood and the kind of willful ignorance of the U.S. of the nefarious activities of Iran in the region. So what President Obama did is turn a blind eye on the activities of Iran, enable the Muslim Brotherhood, which created a lot of instability in the region, whether internally within Middle Eastern countries or externally between Middle Eastern countries. Now, I think that was pivotal in allowing Arab leaders to kind of get a taste of what the world is like right now and who the key players are, what their alliances would look like, and where they're focused at the moment, so how their focus is pivoting and what's important for them. The other concept is the realization that the West has grown to tolerate certain events in the Middle East. So it doesn't come as a shock anymore. It's not like any conflict in the Middle East is automatically a priority for the West. They've grown to tolerate it. They've learned, especially in Europe and for NATO, that not every conflict in the Middle East automatically spills to Europe. Now, some conflicts do, obviously, the Syrian revolution or revolt or conflict. And then, but anything within other regions is not necessarily a threat to Europe. It doesn't necessarily spill over to Europe. So there's this tolerance that didn't exist before. So there's less of an intervention and more of a laissez-faire approach where I really don't care what happens there for a certain number of events. And this, I think, was also important for Arab leaders to realize. And then the kind of additional cherry on top of the cake is the realization that the world is not necessarily all governed the same. It's not one world. There's different versions of what the world would look like depending on where you come from. So we've always learned that in the Middle East. If you've been into the Middle East or grew up in the Middle East or learned about the Middle East, you know that Israel plays by different rules than anyone else. It has a carte blanche on so many different things. There's so many UN resolutions, I can't even count them anymore, that incriminate Israel for many of the atrocities that it committed. And just to be clear, I know this is a very controversial point. I don't mix Jewish identity with Israeli identity. I don't do that mistake like many other people do. And I think that's something very important that we missed out on in the Middle East. And I think there's a lot of learnings to be made, whether from the case of Israel, whether from the case of the establishment of Israel. There's obviously the good and the bad. There's a lot to be learned from Israel in terms of, well, there are the accomplishments, and then on the other side, there's the atrocities, and there's a lot of to be learned on both ends. But anyway, I just wanted to mention that for me, this is not a topic about Jewish people or Jewish identity or Jewish presence in the Middle East or a home for the Jewish people. I share all of the admiration in the world for the Jewish people. I've had some of my best friends who were Jewish. I've been exposed to that culture. I've worked with a lot of Jewish people. I tend to see it as a religion rather than a distinct identity. And I know this is very controversial. I know that not a lot of people like that categorization, including some of my friends. But for me, the word Jewish and Arab are not exclusive, mutually exclusive. You could be Arab and Jewish at the same time, which is the way I was brought up, and which is the way most of those in the Middle East who are from my same age category have been brought up, because we keep hearing those stories about our grandfathers going to this Jewish shop, celebrating with this Jewish neighbor, having visits to that Jewish person or that, and all of this interchanging, I would say, cohabitation within the same Arab countries. There was no difference within Arab societies between a Jew, a Christian, and a Muslim, not until the last 40 years at least. And for all intents and purposes, a Lebanese Jew is a Lebanese, a Syrian Jew is a Syrian, an Egyptian Jew is an Egyptian. It's not mutually exclusive. It's not like if you're a Jew from the Middle East, you have to be Israeli, and if you're Israeli, then you have to be a Jew. I kind of tend to see that very differently. And I'm sorry this is taking too long. I just wanted to clarify that, because I know that this is a key point to make, because it kind of sets a lot of people off, and they tend to kind of disconnect as soon as they hear the word Israel. Now, again, if you were to go back to that, if you were in the Middle East, you know that Israel plays by entirely different rules from everybody else. It has a carte blanche. It does whatever it wants. It's not subject to anything or anyone. Sometimes it even goes against the policies of the U.S. itself, which is its closest ally. We see that in the closeness of relationships between Israel and China, which are developing at a rapid pace. But anyway, that's a topic for another day. So what I wanted to mention is, and the point out of all of this is that it's not exclusive to Israel. It's not only Israel that plays by different rules. I could give you cases from all across the globe where our allies get a lot of leeway and a lot of flexibility in what they do, which is not afforded to our rivals, enemies, or competitors. And this is very paradoxical, and it's very controversial, hypocritical, let's say, because you can't really promote a set of values that are not universal and that shift based on geography and allegiance and alliances and who's close to me or not. Now, you absolutely can if you want to expand your global influence, but it's not the right way to do it if you prioritize these values above all else. Now, if I want to give a few examples, I'll probably give the example of, and from the top of my head, I would say, I would take the example of Europe at first. Now, if you've experienced this in any way, you know that certain countries in Europe are afforded a level of respect that goes beyond their national influence and national capabilities and kind of presence on the world stage. Now, I'm not saying these countries are not important. I'm just saying that these countries decide not to intervene unless they want to intervene. So they're not a a default player on the world stage. They're selectively influencing events. It's not like the US or the rest of NATO that involves itself in so many events and tries to mediate in the best way possible. They're more of on the back burner, so to speak, where they only intervene whenever it's in their interests, and they have more of a presence in certain regions than others. Now, some of these countries are afforded a lot of importance and a lot of influence that is not relevant to their size or impact on the world stage. And this is done as a legacy of imperialism, as a legacy of the fact that they've influenced world culture in so many different ways, and they've been present on a global scale prior to the kind of disintegration of their empires. But the interesting thing is, this is not afforded to all countries in Europe that are like that. So if you'd like to think, if you would think of France, for example, or Germany, or the UK, or Italy, for all intents and purposes, the first thing that comes to mind is, oh my goodness, this is a NATO nation. This is a nation that I should respect. It commands my respect on the world stage. It has a veto in the UN. It has influence over a lot of other things. It's present in so many different regions. But then if you try to afford that same level of respect to other nations that have also been, in part, very influential on the world stage and have had their own empires as well, you would get a very different response. So if I say Spain or Turkey or Russia, then the response is the exact opposite. Now, I understand that some countries are victors. They were victors in the war, World War II to be specific, and World War I. And others are losers, and the world is led by victors. But again, there's this lack of respect for some nations that qualify just as much, if we want to use the same criteria, for that level of respect, like other nations within Europe. And this gives you an idea of how the world is run. So if you're in Turkey, then you're constantly being provoked. If you're in Russia, then you're constantly being provoked, belittled. Your national interests are not prioritized as much. And in the case of Turkey, I would mention it's not necessarily a priority for NATO, although Turkey is one of the biggest members in NATO and one of the old ones. It's also got the second largest military in NATO. The interests of Turkey are not necessarily the interests of NATO. And nowadays, it's actually vice versa as well, which is, I find, very intriguing. I'm not defending any of those nations. My allegiance is to the West. I live in the West. I enjoy living in the West. I love here. I find I belong here. And I admire a lot of the West, of what the West is doing. But again, as I mentioned in previous episodes, I'm trying to be a free thinker and play the devil's advocate at times to kind of delineate myself from a version that I find more of a propaganda kind of a version that is being circulated out there rather than a realistic one that kind of looks at the world with both eyes. Now, again, if we go back to that, I don't think we're affording the same level of respect to Russia or Turkey or other countries. Now, I'm against the war in Ukraine. That is, I don't know if I made this obviously, I don't know if I declared this obviously in the past or not, but I'm against the war in Ukraine. I don't believe it's a just war. I believe the Ukrainian people have their free will. They could decide who they want to align with. It's their business, and I could draw parallels between Ukraine and Syria. I find the Ukrainian people are being subjected to the same level of punishment as the Syrians were subjected to just because they decided to shift west rather than stay or align east. Now, this is a very good segue to the next region of the world where you tend to see the difference in approach in dealing with Ukraine, refugees from Ukraine, and in dealing with Syrians and refugees from Syria. And which brings us to another point whereby anything that goes on in Europe is the world's problem. Again, because we're affording a lot of respect to a lot of nations in Europe. But anything that goes on in the world is not Europe's problem. It's like Europe is living in this bubble where they have a glass shield, where it's a magical kingdom where everything happens in isolation from the rest of the world, which you should be concerned about, which you should try to preserve in its current beauty, but not necessarily expect anything out of if you have an issue of your own, if you live outside of Europe. And I think this was very important in kind of allowing Arab countries to realize that. There's also other examples. So if I want to shift to Asia, for example, I'd like to use two examples, the one in China and the one in India. So if you look at China, in particular, its treatment of its minorities, especially in Tibet, the Uyghurs in Western China, the Christians at some point in their intervention or their attempt to intervene in the affairs of the Catholic Church of China. All of this is mediatized. It's something that we know about. It's something that we care about. It's something that is absolutely horrific. But you tend to see here that as long as it involves certain groups, then it's not necessarily something that the West is very keen on pinpointing, except for certain at certain periods of time when it's convenient. And to give the West credit, or to give NATO credit, or to give Western nations credit, it's also the same case with Arab nations and Muslim nations. So in the case of the Uyghurs, we hear about it every now and then, but it's definitely not the same as the reaction we kept hearing about for years and years in the case of Tibet and the case of Tibetans, to be precise, and the Dalai Lama and so on and so forth. So there are two key points here. We care about the Uyghurs, but not enough to provoke China. We care about Taiwan much more than the Uyghurs, and it's a different approach for each. So that's point one. And then point two, if we shift focus and look at India, India does the exact same thing with its minorities, but it gets a free pass. No one cares. No one talks about it. It's not as mediatized. It's not much of a concern. Now, you hear all of this rhetoric in the West about promoting universal values of tolerance, of diversity, of acceptance. In all honesty, to give the West credit, it is the case in the West. These values are promoted. Case in point, I benefit from these values. Being able to present this content online and talk about it, the liberty, the rights that I have, the freedom of expression is beyond anything I would have imagined in the Middle East. But on the world stage, there's this level of hypocrisy because we prioritize alliances and national interests above all else. And now I'm not saying this is wrong because the world is a very rough place. I'm just saying it's paradoxical, it's hypocritical, and we need to kind of look at it closely and kind of analyze it and analyze the impacts of that. Now, to go back to India, the Prime Minister of India and the current government of India are aligned to an extremist movement, extremist national religious movement in India. And that is aligned to the Hindu faith. I have nothing against Hindus. I have amazing friends that are Hindus. I've interacted with Hindus. They boast very admirable values, like many others who adhere to other different religions or that are atheists. It's not directed at the Hindu religion. It's just that the fact that this is an extremist, nationalist, religious movement with a very dangerous ideology, that it acts upon. And we have different examples of how the government either enabled or turned a blind eye on many of the unfaithful events that are committed against the Sikh minority or against Muslims in India, and the rules and the laws that are coming out, and the invasion, or I wouldn't call it an invasion because it's an internal kind of issue. Well, not necessarily internal because there's this conflict with Pakistan, but the way the Indian army entered Kashmir, the way it was handled, how they cut off communication to Kashmir, how you were not able to learn about anything in Kashmir, how they reversed that very specific clause in the constitution that grants a lot of independence or self-rule to Kashmir. All of this is horrific in Western standards. But it seems we don't care about it much. It seems it's not of major concern to us as long as India could counterbalance China in Asia. So we have a problem if China does it. But we don't have a problem if India does the exact same thing, which is very, very, I would call ironic, because they're neighboring countries. Like, you don't really have to look across the map to draw parallels here. They're neighboring countries committing the exact same thing. And we got this labeling of China as a dictatorship or totalitarian regime, which it really is. I'm not a fan of the way China is governed. But you have this picturing of India as the world leading democracy outside of the Western world, as the biggest democracy in terms of population or in terms of number of voters, which is not necessarily the case. India is a flawed democracy. Like many other countries across the globe, you cannot turn a blind eye on that. India is too big on the world stage and has so much of an impact that you can't necessarily ignore what goes on in there. And now if you look at this, you see that the world is very different depending on where you're from. And there are so many multiple other examples across the globe. You could get the example of Myanmar and the Rohingya, the atrocities that were committed. No one really cared about that. We heard about it in the news for a few weeks, and then it kind of disappeared entirely because we were trying to kind of negotiate with the junta. We were trying to bring him back to the fold and try to have some form of democratic rule where a civilian government is set up in Myanmar. And we all saw how that backfired eventually. But you have this duality of approach that for the average person doesn't inspire a lot of confidence in the values that we're trying to promote across the globe. And there's this big movement, this big resistance movement against these values, particularly because of that. Another example I would think of is Libya and North Korea. Entirely different approaches. But again, I think I've exhausted this, so I don't want to go into that specific example. I just wanted to mention this and then kind of conclude it by discussing a very important concept, which I believe Arab countries have not yet realized, or at least Arab leaders, or even the wider Middle East for that matter, which I believe they should start realizing. The world is not a just place. It's not about justice. The world order doesn't believe in justice. It's about power. It's about national interests. It's about geopolitical strategies. If you're right, that doesn't mean you're going to get the same level of support as someone else who's right. Now, you could be more right or less right, but that doesn't mean anything. You cannot just expect the world to give you something just because you're right. It doesn't work that way. And I think Arab countries have not realized that yet. It's not about how just your cause is. It's about what rule you play with. What do you bring to the table, and what are you going to give me in return? And they missed out on that point so long for so long and so forth that they have nothing to offer. Middle Eastern leaders, and in particular Arab leaders, have not created anything of value that they could bargain with on the world stage. And they keep expecting a fair treatment because some of their causes are right. And by the way, as I mentioned, these causes are not necessarily aligned to the causes of their people, but regardless, they're expecting that they're going to get a fair treatment, and that they're going to get handouts, and that they're going to get support, and that they're going to get allegiance to go about doing what they're doing when they have nothing to bring to the table in a world that is dominated by a superpower currently being challenged by other emerging powers, where there's this constant friction in so many parts of the world, and the Middle East is not on the mind of many. And let alone, you lack legitimacy, you lack credibility, you live in a region that is not of a priority, or at least not as much of a priority anymore, where you have these 40-year-old alliances or partnerships where which are basically outdated, where you're playing by ancient rules that are no longer relevant in today's world, whereby you live in a bubble, you think everything is static when the world is very dynamic, and whereby you've got nothing to offer, and you've been surviving on aid, and you've been dependent on the West for so long, and expecting this never to end. It's as if you have a teenager who decided not to go to college, decided not to finish high school, who lives in your basement, expecting an allowance at the end of every month, and whereby you have other siblings. He has other siblings which are very successful, which are demanding much more of the parent's attention, which the parent is focusing on precisely for that reason. And that teenager in the basement, or that, well, I wouldn't call him a teenager because he skipped out on so many different things, but that person in the basement is still expecting to live in that basement in his own bubble, getting that allowance and not contributing anything in return. And this is why I believe it's critical for Middle Eastern leaders to look back and reassess where they stand and start to prioritize some of the right strategies, some of the right objectives, and some of the right causes for their people, which will ultimately lead to their prosperity as well. Now, I don't know what your take is on this. I would appreciate it if you have a different opinion, or if you think that I missed out on anything, that you would react to me, similar to my friend, my very dear friend, who corrected some of the information I shared in the last episode. But please react in any way if you could, and let me know what you think. And hopefully I'll see you in the next episode. I'm sorry that this is a bit of an emotional process for me, because I'm very passionate about this region of the world, as I mentioned earlier. And I think there's a lot of missed opportunities that need to be addressed before that region could move forward. I think it's in a gridlock. It's sometimes it's actually moving backwards rather than moving forward. And I think there's a lot to be done. And I think now is the time to do it before it's way too late. They're already late on so many different things. And I think now is the time to take action. Now, before I go, I just wanted to remind you that this podcast is available in audio-only format. You could find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Amazon Music. So if you tend to enjoy this content, which is more on the longer side of things, in audio-only format, which is more convenient for you, then please go visit, look us up on these platforms. It's the same name, the Weekly Point with Z, and it's available on all of these platforms, as I mentioned earlier. Now, I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Hopefully, it will include other interesting topics. And if you think that there's a particular topic that you would like to learn more about, then please shoot me an email or comment in the comment section on YouTube, and I would be happy to look into it and discuss it with you in future episodes. Thank you, and I'll see you next week.